Hello and welcome to my channel, The Curious Coder. Today we'll be discussing another important Spring Boot interview question. What are environment properties and why do we need them? Imagine this. You're building a Spring Boot application and it's working perfectly on your local machine. You're connecting it to a local database, everything runs smoothly, and you think you're good to go. But the moment it's deployed to production, it tries to connect to that same local database and everything collapses. That's where environment properties come in. In real world projects, we work with multiple environments like dev, testing, production, and each of them often uses a different database. So you can't hardcode one DB URL and expect it to work everywhere. Okay, that's why environment specific configuration is required. So let's say there are three environments: a dev environment where you test things while you build them, a testing environment where QA team verifies your code, and finally a production environment where the live application runs. Now, these environments have separate database with different URLs. For example, in dev, the URL might be something like this. In testing, it could be this. And in production, it might be this. So we'll have to define an environment property for DB URL. It will be a key value pair where key is something like spring.datasource.url and its value will keep on changing based on the environment. So I hope you guys got a gist of what environment properties are and why they are required. Now let's see on IntelliJ how they are actually configured in your application and how they are used. So there are two ways to configure environment properties. First is using application.properties file and the other way is using application.yaml file. So right now I'll be using application.properties and I'll show you how we can configure the properties using that file. But later in the video, I'll also show you how we can do the same using the YAML file as well. Okay. So we have this properties file in this folder in resources. You can find it here. And basically you can define the key value pairs that we just discussed over here. Okay, so I'll take a very basic example. I'll just define server.port and give the port as 8070. Okay. And let's say if I wouldn't have given this and if I just run it like this. Okay, so in this case, by default, my application starts on this port 8080. Okay, but if I define a property here as the server.port as 8070 and then I rerun it, great. Now the server started on port 8070. Okay, and I also have created a controller here where I have an API /message. So I can show you this. If I hit this API from 8080, see it's not able to send the request. But if I change it to 8070, great, this works. Okay, so this is how we can configure the properties in this file application.properties. It's very simple. You just have to add a key value pair and it works. Now I want to configure multiple values against this key. Okay, like we discussed earlier that we can basically what we want at the end is that we want to configure different values against one key. So how will I do that? So there are two ways to do that. First is using external files. Basically I can create three different files for three different environments and I can place them externally at some location and my application will read from them. Okay, and the other way is that using Spring Boot files actually. So I'll teach you both of them in detail and we'll see that how each of the approach works because in your company you might be using either of them. Okay, so it's important to learn both of them from interview point of view as well. So let's look at the first approach. In this, we maintain a separate property file outside the application for every environment with configuration values specific to that environment. Okay, so in our example, we are setting the server.port. So let's say on dev, we want the app to run on port 8081. So the external property file will contain server.port as 8081. On test, it's 8082, so file will have 8082. And similarly for production, it will be 8083. So this is how we can configure three different values against the key server.port using three separate files. Now you might be wondering what happened to the application.properties file that we just saw on IntelliJ. Well, that file still exists inside the application jar. It doesn't disappear, it's still a part of your project. But here's the key point. When we provide an external property file, it overrides the internal one. So if a property is present in both the external and the internal file, then the external value takes priority and the internal one is ignored. Okay. But if a property is missing in the external file, then Spring Boot falls back to the value inside application.properties from within the jar. Okay, so let's take an example to understand this better. Suppose we define this property spring.application.name in our internal application.properties. It's a property that defines our application name basically. So I'm keeping its value as interview practice app in the internal file. Now let's say in the dev environment, we define this spring.application.name as dev app, and in test we write spring.application.name as test app. But in production, we don't define this property at all. Okay, so what happens in that case? On dev, Spring will use dev app. On test, it will use test app. But on production, since it's missing in the external file, it will use the internal one, interview practice app. Okay, so this fallback mechanism allows us to maintain default values inside the jar while still customizing them as needed for each environment using external configurations. Now, one more additional point here, that how do we actually tell Spring Boot to read this external property file instead of the one inside the jar? So it's very simple. When we run the application, we just pass the path of the external file using a command line argument, something like this. That's how we make our application behave differently for each environment without changing any code, because we passed this location as a command line argument and didn't actually change the code of the application. So I hope this first approach is clear to you. Now there is a drawback to this approach. Basically what we are doing is we are asking our application to read from a file which is placed at some location, right? But what if someone replaces the file at that location? Or maybe it's not replaced, but someone changes the data inside that file and the file gets corrupted, right? So, I know it's unlikely, but still, if it's a manual job, then a human error can take place and this can be done, right? So how can this be avoided? A better solution is that we keep all the three files inside our application instead of keeping them outside. Okay, and ask the application to read it from inside only, right? But now you can argue that the same mistake can be made inside as well. The file could be wrong inside as well, the data could be corrupted. But here's the thing, when we keep the files inside our application goes through a series of testing. Okay, so before it goes to production, a lot of testing takes place, dev testing, QA testing, it goes through demos. So it's highly unlikely that the mistake is not caught. Okay, so in that case, we will have better control over our files, and that's why it's better to keep it inside the application. And that's exactly what we'll do in the second approach. Okay, so let's see the second approach. So what I'll do is I'll create three different files. I'll go to resources and create a file, application dev.properties, and here I can give the server.port as 8081. Okay, I'll continue with the same example, and I'll just copy this file and paste it here with the name as application.test. Here we can take it as 8082, and if I paste it again, now this time for prod, application prod.properties, and the port is 8083. Fine, so I have taken the same example, but this time I have created all the three files inside the application, right? And we also have this file, the application.properties, which is the default one, and here we have the port as 8070. Fine, so I'll rerun my project. Okay, so this time the server started on the port 8070. Now why? Why is that? Because you see, we have created three separate files, but Spring Boot doesn't know yet that from where it has to read, right? So Spring Boot only knows that we have a default file, application.properties. So it comes to this file and it sees that, okay, we have this server.port as 8070, and hence the application runs on 8070. Okay, so if I have to activate these files, then I will have to tell Spring Boot that it has to explicitly go to one of these files and read from it, right? So how can I do that? So basically we use a concept of Spring profiles here. Okay, if we have to activate any of these files, then I will have to create a profile for that particular file. Okay, so I'll show you spring.profiles.active, let's say dev. Fine. So basically, since Spring Boot knows this file application.properties, so here only I'll be giving this configuration spring.profiles.active, and I'll activate this particular profile dev. Fine. So the naming convention is that this should be same as whatever I have written here after the hyphen. Okay. And similarly, I can write test and prod over here. So whichever profile I want to be activated, I'll write it here. And now if I rerun my project, great. This time it runs on port 8081. And you can also see a logger saying that the following one profile is active, dev. Okay. So what happened is that Spring Boot again read from this file only, application.properties. It saw this as well, server.port as 8070. But then it saw that one profile is active. Okay, and which one? The dev one. So then it scanned the project again and it saw that, okay, we have this file here, application.dev.properties. And here we have the same key, server.port, but its value is 8081. Okay, so it overrides the default application.properties the same way that was done when we were talking about that external property file. Okay, so it's the same logic. So if I change it to test, in that case the test file will override the default application.properties, and this time you can see that it will run on port 8082. Okay, and the profile which is active is test. And if similarly if I change it to prod, so by the same logic, yeah, so okay, so by the same logic it runs on 8083 and the activated profile is prod. Fine. Now what is the purpose of this statement then, this server.port as 8070? So let's say if I remove it from here, from prod, and the active profile is prod, right? Now if I rerun it, great, it runs on the port 8070. Why? Because again it uses this file as a fallback mechanism. So since in application.prod we don't have that property server.port, that's why it then falls back to this class basically this file application.properties, which is the default one, and it sees that key over here which says server.port as 8070. Okay, so this is how we can configure various profiles for our project. Now we can also activate multiple profiles together at the same time. Okay, so let me show you. What I'll do is I'll just add it like this, prod, test, dev. So this means that all the three profiles are active at the same time. Okay, and their priority order is from left to right. So prod will have the least priority and dev will have the most priority. Okay, so in case of conflict, dev will be considered first and prod will be considered last. Okay, so let me just run this. Okay, first I'll add server.port as 8083 again. So in dev it's 8081, in prod it's 8083, and in test it's 8082. And in our default file we have it as 8070, and all the three profiles are active. Okay, so I'll just run it. Cool. So it started on port 8081. Why? Because the dev profile has the most priority. Okay, and you can see in the logger that the following three profiles are active. Okay, so now the logger is also saying that all the three profiles are active. Okay, so let's do one thing. I'll just remove this server.port from the dev file, and now let's see what happens. Great. So it started on port 8082 and still all the three profiles are active. Okay, so why did it start on 8082? Because after dev, the second priority is of test, and in test we have it as 8082. Okay, so this is how it works. Now had it been only dev profile, let's say I would have activated only the dev profile, and now if I run it, great. Now it starts on 8070. Okay, why? Because in this case, the test and the prod are not at all active. Okay, they are not active. So after dev, it will not consider any of these profiles. It will directly go to the fallback application.properties, which is this one, the default one. Okay, so this is the difference. Like if we activate these profiles, we still consider them, and only in case of a conflict, we consider the one which has the highest priority. But let's say there is no conflict, then the lowest priority also gets considered. But if those profiles are never active, then you can assume that these two files have no use here. Okay, we can add as many properties as we want, but they will never be considered because their profiles are never active. Okay, so this is how it works. Now let's say let's complete this example. It was like this: prod comma test comma dev, and in dev I don't have the property. Let's say I don't have the property in test as well. Okay, so now if I rerun it, great. So this time it starts on port 8083, which is basically this one, the application prod.properties one. Okay, because next in line was this prod one, and you can guess this, that if I remove it from here as well, great. So then it starts on port 8070. Okay, so it will be coming to the fallback application.properties, because now none of them have configured server.port in their property file. Okay, cool. Now there is one problem in this approach. What we are doing is we are defining a priority order in this application.properties file, but this application.properties file will always be the same for all the environments. Okay, because this file is part of the application, and hence it will be part of the application jar that will be deployed on all the environments. And we have already seen that we deploy the same jar on all environments. So we cannot have a different application.properties file for different environments, and hence we cannot have a different priority order for different environment. Getting my point? So let's say in this example, dev has the most priority. So when we deploy our application to dev, it will have the most priority. But when we deploy it to test, then also dev profile will have the most priority. Right? But that is wrong. Okay, so that should not happen. What I want is that in dev environment, dev profile should be given the most priority. In test profile should have the most priority. And similarly in production, prod profile should have the most priority. Right? So somehow I want this property to be set dynamically instead of hard coding it here in application.properties file. Right? So how can that be done? Basically, the answer is very simple. We will have to use command line arguments for that. Okay, so instead of hard coding it here, we'll have to use a command line argument while running our application. So when we will deploy on dev, in the command line argument, we'll give this property and activate the dev profile, or maybe give it the highest priority. Similarly, when we deploy on test, we'll give test the highest priority, and when we'll deploy on production, we'll give the production the highest priority while running the command. Okay, and I can show you the same here in IntelliJ as well. Here we have one option. You go here, edit configuration, and in modify options we have add VM options. Okay, so here we can write it like this: -d spring dot profiles dot active is equal to, let's say, dev. Okay, so it's like command line argument only, and I'll apply my changes. Okay, I think it's small d, yeah, dev, and I'll apply my changes and okay. And now if I rerun it, okay, so first let me check, do we have any? Okay, so we don't have any port. First let me add a port here, server.port as 8081. Okay, and let's say do I have this? Yeah, so it's already dev, and if I run it, Great. So it started on port 8081 and you can see that the profile which is active is dev. Now I will not change anything in the code. I'll just change my configuration to test and I'll run it again. Great. So actually it's 8070 because I think in test we don't have anything. Yeah, so in test we don't have anything, so it went back to the fallback. But again, if I will add here server.port as 8082 and I'll rerun it again. Cool. So it started on port 8082 and you can see the profile which is active is test. Fine. So this is how we can give our Spring profile configuration dynamically, and this is exactly what we do while we deploy the application to our environments. Okay, so I hope it's clear. Now I'll tell you about one very important and interesting annotation, @profile annotation. Okay, so what it does is, let's say I want to create a class, let's say employee, and I want to create a bean of this class. Okay, but I want to create the bean only on the dev environment and not on prod and test environment. Okay, so how can that be done? For that we use @profile annotation. Okay, so I'll just add @profile and I'll add dev over here. Okay, and let's create a constructor to see. System.out.println. This is employee bean. Okay, so I have created an employee class and I have configured @profile as dev. So the bean will be created only when the profile is dev. Okay, so right now in the configuration, the profile is test. So let's change it to dev, apply. Okay, and I'll rerun my project. Great. So you can see this print statement that this bean has been initialized. And now if I change it to, let's say, test. Okay. Great. So now it's not created. Okay, we can check this. Okay, so it's not created. Fine. So this is how, if we want to create a particular bean based on some environment, so this can be done using @profile annotation, and we can actually configure it for multiple environments as well, like this. Let's say it was configured for dev and test, and now if I rerun it, okay, so now the employee bean is created because it was configured for both dev as well as test, and our profile, active profile, was test. Now let's say if it's prod and I apply again. Okay, now it's not created. Fine. So this is how we can work with @profile annotation. If you found the video helpful, please like, subscribe and hit the bell icon. Also, don't forget to catch today's tip of the day.